It was like the third class in this module on a series on emptiness. And like today, I was actually thinking to be a little more, delve a little bit more into Buddhist philosophy. At first, I was hesitant about that, but then I thought, actually, I felt a little bit more courage because I thought the Dalai Lama, wherever he goes, he talks about these things. Actually, he doesn't hesitate, even if people aren't so familiar. He just dives in. So I thought that we can try. And also, Dalai Lama's coming, right? So to the area, so maybe then if people are a little familiar, then when he talks about it, we'll understand it. In particular, I want to kind of just introduce the idea of Buddhist, what they call Buddhist tenet systems. It's just to explain why they help a person to meditate on emptiness. But I want to start with what are called the four seals of the Dharma. And really what these are if it's like in Buddhist philosophy, when they ask, if one asks, well, what is it that makes a teaching Buddhist or not Buddhist? Right? It's if that teaching is qualified by these four seals, right? There's these four qualities, then it's Buddhist. If it's not, then it doesn't fit into the, philosophically it's not, it doesn't qualify as a Buddhist teaching. Because these four things were so fundamental to what the Buddha taught that something that contradicts them can't be said to be Buddhist. So the first of those is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. What does compounded mean? That means it comes together from causes and conditions. That makes sense? So from a Buddhist perspective, right, any phenomenon that arises due to causes and conditions is by nature impermanent. And by impermanent in this context, what Buddhist philosophy is referring to is, sometimes it's said, one way they say it is, it doesn't last another second, another moment. What that really means is impermanent doesn't just mean someday it's going to end. Actually, that's not what impermanent means. Impermanent in this context means it's changing every instant. We don't usually, and one of the reasons, why does the Buddha talk about this actually, right? Part of the reason is that we don't usually see things that way. Right? Like we say, well, now I'm this age, right? Someday I'll be that age, right? But actually we don't really recognize, we don't notice, right? That you don't, what's the word? You don't go to bed one day this age and then wake up someday another age, right? It's a process that's happening instant by instant. Right? Actually, like, if you look at something like an object, right? Ordinarily we say, well, we know this came about due to causes and conditions, right? It was put together. Right? And then we know someday it'll break, right? It may break maybe break after me or before me, right? It may last longer than my life or shorter. But we know someday this will break, right? What we don't usually recognize is that in other words, it's changing instant by instant. Right? It's degenerating instant by instant. And that's the nature of all things that have come together due to causes and conditions, or that they're made up of parts. The reason why that's clarified, right, all compounded phenomena are impermanent, is that from Buddhist philosophy, I'm just getting a little philosophical here, there are certain things that are called uncompounded phenomena. Those don't change instant by instant. One example is unobstructed space. Space is just the space is just empty space, right? That's not emptiness, by the way. Space is just empty, unobstructed space, right? It's not compounded. It didn't come together due to causes and conditions, and it's not changing instant by instant. Also, like concepts. Right? A concept changes if we discuss it, maybe, but it's not changing. In other words, if it's just it does. In other words, because it's not a functioning thing that actually exists on a physical level. The mind actually also is changing instant by instant, right? But a concept that from a Buddhist philosophical point of view, things like unobstructed space or abstract concepts aren't necessarily changing instant by instant. They change when we change them. Like a concept, if we change the definition of something, it's changed. But otherwise, like the idea of what is white, or what is purple, that's not changing instant by instant because it's not a physical object that can change that. So all compounded phenomena are impermanent. That's one of the four seals. Does that make sense? I'll just go through them. The second one is all contaminated phenomena are in the nature of dukkha, which means unsatisfactoriness or suffering. So what does contaminated mean? Here it doesn't mean like radioactive, it doesn't mean, got dirty, right? What it means is anything that arises due to ignorance and afflictive emotions, right? Like so anger, jealousy, craving, addiction, and so on. Anything that arises due to afflictive emotions and ignorance, that means that's what the definition of contaminated is. That means is in the nature of suffering. The main example of this, second of the four seals, is our own body and mind. So what Buddhism is saying is if your body and mind arose due to and are conditioned by ignorance and afflictive emotions, then ultimately it's going to be unsatisfactory, or it is unsatisfactory, right? And it's conditioned by, it's going to inevitably have the experience of suffering. So, and in a sense, that's related right to the first two noble truths, right? We've talked about those before. So, in other words, the cause of suffering and then suffering itself. Right? So this is saying, if it's contaminated by afflictive emotions and ignorance, then there's going to be suffering involved. Then the third of these four seals is that all phenomena are empty and selfless. One thing His Holiness the Dalai Lama often points out, actually, is that this of the four seals, is the one that's truly unique to Buddhism. Actually, other schools of thought, right, include that all. In other words, other schools of thought have noticed that all compounded phenomena are impermanent. Actually, right? Actually, scientists have pointed that out. And many Hindu philosophers have pointed that out. And other, so various philosophical systems have pointed out that all compounded things are impermanent. In the history of philosophy, and history of spiritual thought, religious thought, this idea of emptiness or selflessness is unique to Buddhism. It's a unique contribution that the Buddha gave to this world. Right? This idea of emptiness or selflessness. And this idea that all phenomena are selfless or empty. So what we're going to explore in a few minutes is what does that mean, actually, right? Because that's what this whole series of classes is about, in a sense, is what does this third seal refer to, actually? What does that mean, all things are empty or selfless? What did the Buddha mean when he said that? So I'll go back to that one in a minute. But I want to at least mention the fourth of the four seals, which is nirvana is peace. Right? So which means nirvana, right, the state of nirvana is the liberation from suffering. Is peace in the sense of one is at peace, but also one no longer suffers. And so all Buddhist schools agree on these four things. They all agree that things are impermanent. They all agree that things contaminated by ignorance and afflictive emotions are subject to suffering, or in the nature of suffering. They all agree that phenomena are selfless, and they all agree that nirvana is peace. Sometimes, those of you who were here when Kensei Rinpoche taught, actually it was in Maryland, right? He pointed out that of the lowest of the four tenet systems, which we're about to start talking about, there are like 18, I think it's 18 sub-schools. And one of them actually talks about, it's questionable whether they agree that all phenomena are selfless, because they talk about an inexpressible self. Right? So sometimes His Holiness the Dalai Lama also points out, he says that one is debatable. Are they Buddhist or not Buddhist? They're considered Buddhist because they took refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, right? But their philosophical tenets, their view in terms of tenets, kind of held on to some idea that things are not selfless. So it's debatable whether, they say sometimes, some philosophers said, in one sense they were, from a religious point of view, they were Buddhist, but are their tenets, are their views Buddhist, is question, can be questioned, or debated. But in general, all the Buddhists agree on these topic. So what I wanted to I just wanted to give that as an introduction, right? Because if we're talking about emptiness or selflessness, so that's one of those four seals, right? But then I wanted to start to explore today, and again, we're going to be a little philosophical. I wanted to say something about that, which is, it can be, like I said, it can be challenging, right, to study philosophy. And but I think I often think of there's a quote, I think it's from Sakya Pandit, a great Tibetan scholar and yogi and meditator and teacher, who said, if you want to be wise, forget about being comfortable. And if you want to be comfortable, forget about being wise. Which I thought was a very profound, simple statement. That's true in life, isn't it? There is because wisdom doesn't come from comfort. You have to challenge your own assumptions, right? Whereas it's uncomfortable to challenge our assumptions. It's uncomfortable to be confused and try to figure out something that we don't understand. Right? It's not easy, actually, right? The process of becoming a wiser person is not easy. And you can see that, right? It's from your own experience and also from other people's experience who you know. You can see, right? Wisdom comes through what? Through stepping out of our comfort zone, let's call it that. So anyway, this idea of tenets I thought is an interesting way of starting to do that. Does that make sense? I personally think someday it'll be good at the center to actually do a whole class on tenets. We're not going to do it today, we're just going to do an introduction. And what I wanted to do today, though, was, because also, like most up to now, I've been talking about emptiness from the point of view of the middle way school, right, which is the highest of the four tenet schools. But actually it said, particularly, Buddhist teachers often say, if you can't understand the lower tenet schools, then you're not going to really understand the middle way school. Does that make sense? So I was kind of worried that maybe people will get a wrong idea of what the middle way school is saying if you don't understand the more, what they're calling lower tenet schools. Lower, not in the sense of putting them down, right? They're all Buddhist systems of thought, but lower in the sense of like grosser, not as subtle. Does that make sense? And Tibetan masters often say they break down Buddhist tenets into four major schools, like four groupings, but each one has its own subgroupings, which I'm not going to get into today because that's too complicated. But sometimes Buddhist masters in Tibet say these are like steps going up to the highest. That's one reason they call lower. So also like you don't say, well, the lowest, if I'm going upstairs, the lowest step is bad, right? You need the lowest step to get to the highest step, is the point. So it's like that. You see what I mean? You start at the lower, in order to progress in your understanding of emptiness, you would start at the lower school and go up, up, up until you finally can truly understand the most subtle view. And each of these actually, I often reflect on this myself when I'm contemplating these. Each of these actually, even the lowest school of tenets actually, if one could actually realize it, one would be an amazing person. Actually, right? One would be, the Dalai Lama often said, you'd be so much freer from suffering. Actually, because it would eliminate so many of the causes of your suffering. So each one is very, very profound, actually, and each one helps us understand the next. So maybe I'll just start, and we're going to be a little philosophical in this morning. But I'll get into it. We'll start with the lowest of the four schools, okay, which is usually sometimes called a Great Exposition School by Bhashika. In Sanskrit, it's by Bhashika. And I don't want to try to. I'm not going to try to cover every tenet of these schools. That's not the point today. But we were talking recently about conventional truth and ultimate truth. We were talking about that from the point of view of the middle way school. And I want to say, so what I want to talk about today is a little bit what's the conventional truth and what's the ultimate truth according to each of these. And I should say also, like Jeffrey Hopkins actually points this out in a couple of his books, that in a way by talking about conventional ultimate truth, that's mainly the language. All Buddhist schools use that language, but that language is emphasized in the middle way school. So we're sort of imposing, I'm going to be right now imposing the kind of emphasis of the middle way school on these other schools in order to understand them. But I'm doing that because we're leading towards the middle way school. Otherwise you wouldn't necessarily use that rubric. You might use another rubric to understand them. But I just thought we'll start with that. And so this Great Exposition School, right? I want to go back now to the third seal, right? They say the third seal was all phenomena are selfless. And particularly from the Great Exposition School's point of view, what's important to realize in order to gain liberation is the selflessness of yourself, of a person. Does that make sense? That's their emphasis, right? Because their emphasis, by the way, this is for those of you who are familiar, like with Mahayana and great vehicle and lesser vehicle, this is a lesser vehicle system of tenets. So Anyway, what's important though that I want to get at from this school's point of view, right, is so what is the selflessness of persons? Right? Which means the selflessness of you. Right? That's what's important for your own practice. And so what they say, right, is that like, right, there is of course, I'm sorry to say this. Okay, that a conventional truth, right, is something that exists but can be broken down into smaller parts. Make sense? And an ultimate truth, right, is something that cannot be subdivided. So it's an object of perception that cannot be or an object of an object that exists. Let's call it that. It's an existent object that cannot be subdivided. So they would say, right, like they might take the example. I'm just going to use the example of this, right? So can this be subdivided? This mala, this rosary? Yes, of course, right? So they would say, in what sense is this a rosary, then, or a mala? Right? Well, it's a conventional truth. Whereas we can speak of it as a rosary, right, or as a mala. That's the Tibetan word for it, right? But it's not ultimately that, because it can be subdivided into other things, right? Each bead, right, can be taken off, and then the beads themselves can be taken apart, and I don't know if these are wood or plastic, I'm not quite sure. It's assumed they're wood. That the wood can be subdivided down, right? So in that sense, and a person, right? So can a person be subdivided? Well, there's a body, there's a mind, right? There are moments of experience, right? So of course, right, a person can be subdivided, right? So they would say, whether you're talking about like a mala or you're talking about a person, it's just a conventional truth. Right? It doesn't ultimately exist. Right? It conventionally exists. But what they say, what ultimately exists, right? When they say, well, in other words, their view would be this though, would be if you say it doesn't exist at all, right? First of all, that would contradict experience. And secondly, that would be nihilism, right? It would be denying, nihilism is what, one of the things all Buddhist philosophy systems want to avoid. Because it's viewed as the worst fault in philosophy, right? Just saying nothing exists and not caring. It leads to a kind of apathy and actually leads to a lack of moral basis. So the Great Exposition School says things do exist, right? But we can subdivide them. Right? So what's ultimately true must be the smallest particle. And they break down a couple different ways. One is temporally. So let's say, for example, with the mind, right? They recognize, now remember, all Buddhist schools accept impermanence, right? So this Great Exposition School says, well, the mind and body are impermanent, right? Of course. Right? So then they say, well, what's the basis then? Right? There has to be, if it exists but it's impermanent, there must be some basis that exists, right? So they would say it's the smallest moment, the mind, right? For the mind, they would say the smallest moment of awareness, right? Then you have many of those, and that's how you get a sense of impermanence over time. You can see how it's a reasonable system, right? So they would say that smallest moment is an ultimate truth. It's absolute. Right? That's this school's position. And they would say for physical matter, right? They would say, well, obviously, like a microphone can be broken down. But they would say if you get to the molecular level, right? You get to the tiniest particle, and that would be existent. Right? And then you collect those together, and you get microphones and bodies and cups and malas and rooms, and so on. So do you get the sense now, what's the conventional truth, right? Is that which can be, is an existent thing. It's existent conventionally, but it's not ultimately existent because it can be subdivided. What's ultimately existent are the smallest moments or the smallest particles. Those are ultimate truths from this point of view, from this school system. What I want to ask you to think about now for a moment, that's just a very simple, there's much more to the school, but that's enough in terms of really presenting the school. But now what I want to ask you to do is think about from the point of view of practice. Right? Can you imagine, like, if you realized that? Right? Like, if you were related to objects and to yourself in that way, right? Like, so then, so many, what I'm going to call them are, like, concepts or superimpositions, like imputations or conceptual projections onto things would be cut off, right? In other words, if you really recognize experientially, right, that therefore, right, this idea of me as a person is just a convention, what ultimately exists are these minute moments and particles, right? Like then the idea of mind breaks down, doesn't it? Right? So just from this school's point of view, right, if you realize that, right, then if somebody steals your boyfriend or girlfriend, right, well actually you recognize, first of all, that person's just made up of particles and moments, right? Mine, they're not mine actually, right? You would actually realize that. Right? And so you wouldn't have that kind of anger and hatred and grasping the same way as you would if you didn't realize this. You know, if you, same with you, like any what sort of say that, same thing if somebody, like if somebody actually realized this school's view, right, and then somebody insults them, right? Well, if they recognize their experiences, right, that from this school's point of view, a person who's actually meditating like that, right? Well, in other words, what can they insult actually? It's just a convention, right? Just an idea. It's a conventional truth, right? Ultimately, there are just these particles and moments. Right? And actually the moment that they said the insult is already passed anyway, right? You see how, like, if you realize this school of view, it would be quite profound, actually. Your way of experiencing reality would be very different from an ordinary person's way of it, and quite amazing, actually, wouldn't it? You know, like a yogi who were to realize this school's view, you know, if they got insulted, they wouldn't get upset. Right? If somebody stole their stuff, they would feel at peace. So you can see how this person would be much more peaceful, or a much more peaceful mind than an ordinary person. So, actually, so what's the fault? Like, so why isn't this the highest school? I'll ask you guys. So given the profundity of that, right? And given that they do recognize there's no, in other words, the self is a mere convention, right? It's just conventionally existent. It's not ultimately true. It's not ultimately, the self is not an ultimate truth. It doesn't ultimately, it doesn't exist ultimately. It just exists conventionally, like the self of a person. Then what's the fault? Like, what's wrong with this school's position? Why isn't it the highest? Why don't Buddhists accept it as the highest of all? Accepts impermanence, right? Makes sense of impermanence. Right? These moments that are strung together. Right? So things are impermanent. So does anybody have a thought? Why don't Buddhist masters, why did the other Buddhist masters refute this school and say, well, that's a skillful means that helps people, but no, it's not the ultimate view of the Buddha. It's not. And by the way, like Lama Tsongkhapa says, the ultimate view of the Buddha doesn't just mean, he actually points this out, he says, in terms of tenets, I'm just giving an introduction to this idea. Lama Tsongkhapa says, you can't base, which I think is wonderful, he says you can't base which school is higher and which is lower in tenets based on what the Buddha said or what any other past master said. He said, because the Buddha said all of them. Right? And when the Buddha was teaching this one, he said, this is how things are. Right? Then when he taught another one, he said, that's a, and there are even some teachings where somebody will say, well, you taught this and then you taught that, which is the truth? And depending on the person, he would give a different answer. Like sometimes he would say, well, you know, what I really, you know, what my true intention is this. Then in another scripture he would say, my true intention is that. And the point Lama Tsongkhapa is making there, one is you have to rely on your own reasoning. Does that make sense? That's the first thing. In other words, ultimately, it's not, the basis for which tenet system is correct is not who said it. It's reason. And the second thing that they point out is that also the Buddha said these different things, each of which, let's see what we say this, with the intention of helping certain kinds of people. And so this one, right, one of the, from a tenet system, I mean, from a higher tenet system, one thing they would say is, well, the Buddha taught that to prevent nihilism. In other words, people, if they didn't feel there was something like these minute particles that truly exist, and these minute moments that truly exist, they would feel like nothing exists, and they would become nihilistic. So it was a very skillful method to introduce selflessness to beginners. Does that make sense? But I'll answer my own question because nobody's jumping in. One thing that many Buddhist masters said was, and actually, you know, of course, physicists now agree with this. And that's why the Dalai Lama often meets with physicists, right? Is the idea of a partless particle. Like the idea of a particle that's ultimately existent and substantially there, and sort of like a, you know, like a little tiny circle, a little tiny square. Long ago, Buddhist masters said that's impossible. It doesn't exist. That anything, even the smallest particle, has to be made of parts. Right? And so if you're looking for some, and if it were like, if you imagine some little particle, right? And they pointed out, like, because they have to be relational, even if they're just moving or something, right? It's directional, and directionality implies directionality in relation to something else, which and implies a back and a front, and so on. So long ago, and they said also if you're going to aggregate particles, right? Well, if they're aggregating, then one is in front or behind the other, one is above and below, so relatively there are parts. So a partless particle doesn't make sense. And they said the same thing with temporal time, right? There was, because this school said, well, you have these tiniest particles, you string them together, right? They said, well, if you string them together and they're the tiniest possible, then how does the smallest moment, right, has to have one part of it that's closer to the future and one part that's closer to the past, so it has parts again. And so they said if you analyze it conceptually, it doesn't stand up to reason. Right? There can't be partless moments and partless particles. Does that make sense? So now, if from this school's point of view, if you were really from that school, then the Buddha didn't mention that to them because he felt that those people who needed that would start to feel that nothing exists at all, and they would become nihilistic. And so he said, well, I won't. He said he'll teach them something that's true, but leave out the next step. Does that make sense? Because he didn't want them to become afraid and nihilistic. Kind of makes sense, right? They needed something that felt very substantial. So next, any questions about that one? Should I go on? I want to go on to at least the next one. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll cover the next school, which is called the Sutra School. So Sutra are the teachings of the Buddha, right? So they call them followers of the sutras, followers of the teachings of these scriptures. In Sanskrit, they're Sautrantika. Sautrantika. From their point of view, because they accept this idea that there are no partless particles, right? In other words, they understood that, right? And there are no partless, there are no ultimately, kind of these substantially, ultimate moments, right? That are sort of undividable. So from their point of view, what's the conventional and what's the ultimate truth? So again, remember they accept impermanence, right? All Buddhist schools have to, whatever philosophy they're going to present, it has to be in the context of understanding impermanence. Right? So they say, a conventional truth, right, is something that does not perform, that doesn't. That doesn't function within the context of impermanence. Does that make sense? So it's ultimately you would just say things that are non-functional things. Right? Ultimate truths are functional phenomena that function in the context of impermanence. I'm adding that in the context of impermanence myself just to help explain. Does that make sense? So from their point of view, what does it mean a functioning phenomena, right? What they mean is there are like all those compounded impermanent phenomena. Right? Remember I mentioned earlier compounded? Right? So from their point of view, right, those things are impermanent, of course, right? But so they would give the example, let's take the example of, let's say, just use this as an example, right? Like if you were perceiving this clearly, right, it's a functional phenomenon, right? It's a thing that functions, that's impermanent, right? Or your own body. Right? So they would say, right, that does your body function? Yes. It's impermanent, and it's an ultimate truth, right, from their point of view. Now look, the self, right? Like the self of a person, right? Yourself. Right? What they would say is, can you, actually I'm going to separate from what they would say for a moment. I'm just going to ask you, can you, let's see, we'll see. Like your body can be an object of direct perception. Right? You can go like this and you see your hand. Can you see, in that sense, a self? what they would say is no, right? Like in other words, a self, right, is what? Is a concept. And also, I want to point out something else they would point out, right? They would say, like, let's say, I'm just going to, Fidel, you're right in front of me, so you're like, so Fidel's body, right? Like, so Fidel has eyes, they function, right? But Fidel, the name, right? Actually, that's an imputation, right? That's clear, isn't it? And actually, you know, we say, I would usually say I can see Fidel right there, right? But they actually analyze, they say, can you really see Fidel? No. I see eyes, I see a nose, I see hands, right? But can I see Fidel? Actually, if you reason, of course not, actually, right? In other words, we think, I oftentimes feel as if I see Fidel, right? But actually, right now, for example, somebody else from behind is seeing the back of Fidel's head. I can't see the back of Fidel's head. Right? What I see are certain, like eyes, a nose, mouth. Right? And so, what they're getting at, this school, right, is that we kind of, we have direct perceptions, right? And they would say you can't deny those. Makes sense, actually, right? In other words, you can see how this school is actually getting subtler, right? And quite profound, right? They're not saying there's some kind of partless particles. They would say that doesn't stand up to analysis, right? But they would say, right, like, you can't deny that there are these moments of direct perception of something. Right? And even it could be a moment of direct perception of your own thought, right? Like you suddenly look, right now I feel angry. That's a direct perception of a thought, right, at that moment. They would say that exists. Right? But then they would say, then you, what's the way to say this? Like, that when you take the example of a self, right, a self of a person, that actually that's never an object of direct perception. Right? And so it's just a convention. Right? It's a conventional truth. Does that make sense? It's something that we kind of superimpose on. Right? And there are many things we superimpose, right? Like, I mean, and again, we're going back to my earlier example, but now it's a little more profound, actually, right? So, like if somebody were to steal my car, right? The idea that it's my car is definitely a superimposition, right? I can never perceive direct, like just like I said, I was giving the example of Fidel a minute ago, right? I can perceive colors, right? I can perceive parts, but can I perceive a minus? Is there anything that I can perceive directly that's make that car mine? No. I can perceive my name on a piece, I can directly perceive some scribble on a piece of paper that's like that says something on it, like a title or something. But actually, there's, like, do you see what I'm getting at? Those are superimpositions, actually. Right? And so, actually, from this school's point, like, in earlier classes, I pointed out that in the middle way school, right, when you perceive emptiness, I called it a non-affirming negation. Right? Whereas all you perceive is the recognition. All that appears to the mind is the wisdom understanding that the self does not, that the truly existent self does not exist. In this school, it's different, actually. Ultimate truths, actually, what you're actually perceiving in from this school's point of view, are momentary, direct experiences, right? Direct perceptions of things. And then by implication, you're realizing, wow, there's no self. There's no truly existent self there. Does that make sense? So it's different. In the one school, you're actually, your mind doesn't perceive even, in the middle way school, when you realize emptiness, all that appears to your mind is that lack of a truly existent self. In this school's, and actually I want to use the right term though, they don't use the term truly existent actually. They say, what's appearing to you is maybe your own hand. Right? And then by implication you're realizing the lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person. Does that make sense? Because how does a person exist from this school's point of view? It exists as a mere convention. It's not self-sufficient, right? It's definitely not, right? Because what you're perceiving are moments of mind and moments of body, right? And it's not substantially existent, right? They would say the body is substantially existent, but the self is not. Does that make sense? Because the body's a functioning thing. The self's what? A conventional truth, a superimposition on the body or the mind. This school seems quite profound, doesn't it? And I just want to ask you guys to like pause for a moment and try to imagine like seeing the world that way, right? Can you imagine that? Like, so you have direct perceptions, right? But then you realize anything you add to that, right? Like, is, what's the word? If you add some concepts to that direct perception, right? They're just conventions. Right? There's no, they're not ultimately true. Right? And to yourself, right? Can you imagine that? Like that, when you perceive, right, moments, impermanent, right? So it's impermanence, right? So you perceive these moments of mind, moments of body, right? But you actually recognize, right, that for example, even the idea of continuity, right? It's conventionally true, right? It's a convention, but it's not ultimately existent. Right? In other words, what's ultimately existent are these moments of direct perception. Can you imagine perceiving the world that way? What it would be like?
So are you in charge of your thoughts?
What's that?
You say you decide what kind of thoughts you have. I see you, and then I decide to call you. I decide a concept.
Yeah.
So I just decide.
It's actually not decided, it's just a bad habit, right?
It's a habit.
It's a bad habit. You know, they would say we have a bad habit of believing, right? And from this school's point of view, would say it's not that you say I want to believe in a substantially existent person, right? Yeah. Self-sufficient. They would say due to beginningless habit of ignorance, right? That I have the habit of believing in those kind of making and believing in those concepts. Does that make sense? And believing they're truly there, right? Even when, like, I believe that there's a truly existent, I'm going to use the right term here, substantially existent, right? Substantial and self-existent person. Self-sufficient and substantially existent. Self-sufficient, that's the word, right? But it's not self-sufficient, right? So it's a wrong idea, but I, out of habit, believe that all the time.
So I believe that I'm in charge of my thoughts?
Actually, what you believe really is that, like that there's a self-sufficient, right? What does that mean? Self-sufficient. Like a unitary, existent by itself person there.
Like independent.
Independent, right? And that doesn't exist, right? That's what the school's saying. That you believe intuitively, right? Not just by learning, but intuitively, you believe there's a unitary, self-sufficient, right? It doesn't depend on just the body and mind. It's not just labeled or something, right? You believe that there's a self-sufficient, right? Like just there, unitary, and what's the other word? And substantially existent, right? Like solid self there in you. Right? This was saying that's ignorance. That thing doesn't exist in you.
So it has to do with the soul too?
So yeah, like what they would say actually is that actually all Buddhist schools say this. I just want to clarify this point too, because you asked a good question. He said, is that like the soul? And I want to make a point. Like actually all Buddhist schools agree on this, although they talk about it in different ways. So I'm just going to say it in a kind of general way for the moment. Is that there are two different types of ignorance as we're meditating on these things. One is philosophically acquired ignorance. Like some people have and you'll actually see, if you meditate, you'll see it in your own experience, that there are two, right? One is, I don't know what the word is, like if you go to, if you have a philosophical view that there's an eternal, permanent self there, right? There are schools of thought that have that, right? Like a soul, right? So maybe you read a New Age book and you said, I have a soul, and it's whatever, something. You give it some qualities and you say it, right? Like, they would say that's one level of wrong understanding, but that is actually not the main target of meditation on selflessness in this case. One has to overcome that, right? Because when there is the idea of like, let's say, a substantially existent, independent, unitary soul that's somewhere in here. Right? But actually what they're saying is that there's a more innate, instinctual habit of ignorance that even if somebody never learned any philosophical view, it's still there because we had it in the past. They would say because you had it in a past life, and then it comes and it continues all the time. Does that make sense? So they would say, and that in a sense, like those philosophical positions are sort of, I don't know what the word is, grow out of that instinctual ignorance. Does that make sense? And the instinctual ignorance is the main cause of our suffering, because you have that even when you're born, right? Even babies have that before they're taught any philosophical systems. So, like, in other words, then we can call it a soul, right? Like, or an Atman in Sanskrit terminology and so on. But really, there's an important point there. So there's sort of learned intellectual ideas of a permanent self, and then there's the innate view, and we have to overcome ultimately the innate one also. And all Buddhist schools agree on that. So I want to ask you guys a question. So you can see how profound this view is. I want to ask, so gosh, what's wrong with this one? That seems like it should be, when you think about it, if you really meditate on this one, right, you could almost say, well, that should be the ultimate view of Buddhism. It seems very, very profound, actually, doesn't it? So why would that, why continue on past that? Why not just stop there and say, yeah, that makes sense. That's a very profound view of selflessness, right? Functioning things truly exist. But, non-functioning sort of superpositions like self are sort of just conventions. They don't subsist in the nature of those things.
So it means I couldn't come up with a concept that would be ultimately truth, because that.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not sure how they're distinguishing, because, if you think about the self being conventional, but a table is also conventional, but they're saying it's not. Like, I don't see how they're making that difference, because if you start to analyze a table, at what point does it stop being a table?
And just to clarify what you're saying, like, because when you say analyzing a table, right? Because there are two different ways one could take that. So I just want to ask which one you mean. One is like table as the referent, right, of the sound table. That's one, right? Or another is table in the sense of even on a physical level, as an existent functioning thing.
Right.
Which are you referring to?
I was thinking of the physical level.
Okay. And why, like, keep going, why would it, like, why is it hard to see how that still is substantially existent, or truly existent?
Well, for instance, in front of you, is that a table? What is the tableness? Does it have to have 4 legs? That really only has 2 legs, and they fold up. Is that a requirement of the table? What if they don't fold, and what if it's made of glass or metal? And what about the height? If you keep chopping the legs off, at some point, is it still a table? If you take 1 leg off, 2 legs off, then where's the table? So there's a way that we're perceiving a table on objects, just like we're perceiving a self on the objects of mind and body.
So do you guys hear how radical what Jyoti's saying is in a way, right? Like, because it's one thing, right? Like, actually that's quite radical, right? Like, so to look at a table, so Jyoti's really challenging us, right? Like, so I want to think about this. Many of you are sitting on a chair, right? So Jyoti's saying, like, Actually, I don't know, are you saying maybe a chair is not a chair from its own side?
Right. Like, how are they saying that's an ultimate truth? Like, how are they seeing that differently from your sense of self?
Yeah. So how disturbing is that though to people, to think the chair you're sitting on might not be a chair from its own side? That's what Jody's suggesting. Like, right, that it may not be a substantially existent chair or a truly existent chair, right? Because it has parts, Jody's saying, right? That's what Jody's raising as a question, right? Like, wow, right? And then like, so Jody's suggesting a possibility, right? That, and even your body then, right? So Jody's, I mean, implication from what Jody's saying, right, is that the chair you're sitting on, because it's made of parts, may not be an ultimate truth, may not ultimately exist in that sense, right? And then your body that's sitting on it, because it's made of parts, may not be an ultimate truth, and may not truly exist, inherently exists from its own side. Like, does that feel disturbing at all to anybody, or no? What Jody's suggesting?
It's starting to feel comfortable to me. I'm starting to like it more and more.
I think it leads to more questioning and deeper thoughts, which can be good, or I think it depends on where you are in your life for that moment. Like in one sense, I can be like, that's cool, that's deep, and another moment I could feel anxiety, like,
Yeah.
when is this gonna...
Yeah, you can see how it's deconstructing, right? It's like deconstruct. I mean, these questions lead to a kind of deconstructing of our of things that we previously felt very confident and comfortable in, right? We felt confident that we were correct, and they also felt comfortable to us, like normal, like our normal view of things, right? Then Jody asks a question like that, and suddenly you feel, either comfortable or uncomfortable, but wow, it's like challenging something that we thought seemed pretty clear. Right? Yeah, so like, right? Yeah, so a cup is a functioning thing, right? But then, you can almost add, like, so this still has tea in it, right? So then you can say, well, if it's made up of, Jody's asking the question, right? If it's made up of parts, right, then is it an ultimate truth? Does it exist in an ultimate sense, right? And yet it still functions, right? The tea's not falling all over me, right? From asking the question. So how does it function? Right? When it starts to ask these questions, right? So yet things do function, right? So now we're sort of what's the word? We're challenging the view of the Sutra School, right? We're saying, on the one hand, it's very profound, right? And you can see there's a truth to it, right? We do perceive things directly, right? We do superimpose other concepts onto those things, right? But Jody asked a question that takes us a step deeper, right? Which is, even those things, right, that seem to be, from the Sutra School's point of view, ultimate truths, right? Like a microphone is functioning, right? It's working. But it's made up of all kinds of wires and parts, right? So maybe it's not an ultimate truth, Jody. So now Jody's moved us past the Sutra School, right? Jody's question moves us beyond the Sutra School to the great vehicle scriptures, right? The great vehicle schools of tenets.
Not only that, the view says that basically it's kind of contradictory to, I mean, it says basically the same view is not a conventional truth because it's a concept. So concepts are not ultimate truths because they are impermanent. So this same view is a conventional truth. So you may want to settle for a conventional truth, or are you in search of an ultimate truth?
Mm.
If you embrace a concept, then you embrace conventional truth and you settle for conventional truth instead of a search for the ultimate truth.
Yeah, I think I understood what you said. I'm not sure. Was there a question though, or just a
I
question?
mean, yeah, kind of. I
What's the
mean,
question? So what's the question?
I mean,
for it?
well, not necessarily. It's just a thought.
Okay, yeah, no, that's clear then.
Yeah.
I just wasn't sure if there was a question in there. So.
Alright.
Oh, that's clear. Well, so then, so now I want to at least briefly cover the next two, right? So the next one up, right, the third of the four major, again, each of these has subdivisions that we can make, but I'm not getting into that today, I said. So the next one up would be the mind-only school. In Sanskrit, Chitta Matra, mind only. which is a great vehicle, right? Mahayana school of tenets, and you know, there are said to be two. You know, sometimes you'll hear. I'm just saying because you'll hear this, and if you read Buddhist scriptures or hear people talk, the Dalai Lama or Lama Zopa or other teachers. So they're like called in the Mahayana. They're called two, like sometimes they call them way openers or charioteers, like chariot. You know, and those are Asanga and Nagarjuna because they each started, in a sense, these two. Nagarjuna started the middle way school. I mean, in a sense, the Buddha started, but it's a philosophical school that existed in India. Nagarjuna kind of opened the way to explaining that. But this mind-only school was opened or explained initially by Asanga and his brother, his half-brother, Vasubandhu. So those are very famous. If you're studying Buddhist scriptures, you'll read them a lot. Vasubandhu, in Tibet they still study all the time his Abhidhamma teachings. The monks study for years. So anyway, so this mind-only school, right? So, so what is so what they would say, actually, in terms of, I just want to start, okay, so what's, I was using this rubric of conventional truth and ultimate truth. I just want to go back to that initially, and then I want to explain. From their point of view, a conventional truth is anything, one way of saying it is any existent thing that's other than emptiness. Hesitate because you can get it. They use a different rubric really. Three natures, what they call it. But maybe I won't get into that because that would be too complicated today. Some of the, and if we're doing tenets, we'll go to the three natures. And that's their way of really explaining reality deeply. But we'll say this. So I'll just put it simply. That from their point of view, conventional truth would be something other than emptiness, and ultimate truth is emptiness. So they're the first one that really were going back to what I said earlier about. They're similar to the middle way school from Lama Tsongkhapa's point of view in this way. That emptiness, when emptiness appears to the mind, all that appears to the mind is emptiness. That makes sense? When somebody realizes emptiness, all that appears to their mind is emptiness. There's no longer, like in the Sutra School and the Great Exposition School, where you're sort of, where a conventional, like a, not a conventional in that sense, because they would say it's ultimate, but where an appearance of objects appears, right? And then you're by implication realizing, you know, so you might be seeing, like from those other schools, you might be seeing particles or seeing the body, and then realizing that those are empty of a substantially existent, self-sufficient self, right? In this school's point of view, when you realize emptiness, all that appears to the mind is emptiness. So now I want to say, so empty of what? What's emptiness, right? And so there are two different ways they talk about emptiness. That are related, and each one depends. Actually, the second, they're very much related. These two ways of talking about emptiness, but I want to talk about both of them in a little bit. What they would say, right, is that so they would say, so from this school's point of view, you start with, so let's say there's a, you know, as in any with any school, you have to start with things that appear to you, right? So they would say, so things appear, I'm going to let's take the example of, well, I'll go back to the example of the microphone. Right? So, you know, because all Buddhist schools start with, what we perceive, right? You have to start with that to have discussion, right? So let's say, so you have the appearance of a microphone. So now when they say, and that's a dependent, first of all, they would say it's an impermanent phenomenon, and it's a dependent phenomenon, right? It exists, but it exists dependently. Which is clearly true, by the way, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas both of those things are true, right? Now they would say, right, first of all, I don't want to use the right term, empty of, They would start. You can start with this. It's so a microphone, in a sense, is empty of existing. I'm trying to the right language to say it. Just there's a different way they say it. Your phenomenon is natural. Here, the language this text uses is empty of existing as a natural basis for the name. Another way of saying that, right, is that it's empty of existing as a basis for my naming of like the entity and the attributes of it, right? So in other words, the microphone exists, that's clear, right? But it doesn't exist inherently from its own side as the basis for the name microphone. Make sense?
I'm confused.
That's good. So we're going to keep going. What they're really starting to explore, right, is this question, okay? I'm going to separate for a moment from the actual language of the mind-only school, just try to discuss it for a moment, right? Like we all can perceive a microphone, right? But does a microphone, right, exist out there? Or does a microphone exist? Does it exist? This is the best way to put it. Does microphone, right? I'm going to use that term, right? Microphone. Does microphone exist out there as something separate from your mind, as a separate entity from your mind, or does microphone exist not as a separate entity from your mind? That's the question I want to raise. That's starting to get at what they're getting at in a more conventional discussion. So you have to contemplate that, right? Does microphone exist separate, as a separate entity from your mind, or is not a separate entity from your mind? So is it the same entity? Right?
Does touch come into play though? I mean, it's in front of you.
They would say, well actually, so the question you asked is, does touch, so are you differentiating that somehow touch is inherently different than sight, for example, or hearing?
It's in front of you, you can grab it, you can feel it, you can touch it.
It's material.
It's interesting, right? It's an interesting question. So, in what way does microphone exist? You're saying it exists. In other words, if it exists out there in front of it, so I want to go back to what we said earlier, right? So, if it exists as something I can touch, right? There are a few problems potentially. I'm just raising these. Now I'm separating from the mind only. We're just discussing, okay? One is, if it exists as something I can touch and see, right, out there, totally separate from my mind, then are you going back to the position of the Great Exposition School? Like, in other words, it exists as particles, as ultimately existent, substantially, kind of these inherently existent, independent, sort of ultimate truth particles that are findable and sort of truly existent? Is that how I can touch it? And
Our senses that we have, the seeing, touching, feeling, smelling, they influence us.
they what?
They influence us in what we see.
So is it the same entity as your senses, or a different entity than your senses? The microphone. Is it the same
not
way?
sure. I wasn't thinking about this when I drove here.
No, that's why. That's why we're exploring it. It's just interesting. It's good that you're asking questions. That's all. This is how we contemplate. To me, these are good questions. Just we're contemplating together. I think you're representing other people's questions too. And other people can jump in. But you see what we're getting at there. Like, it's starting to ask a question. Like so, if there aren't substantially, we already kind of addressed that there aren't these substantially existent independent particles, right? And so then what's touching what is part of what I'm just asking this question.
Are you saying if we weren't here to see it, would it be here? Kind of like if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, did it make a sound?
Not quite, in a sense. Like, really what we're asking, that might be related, but we're asking something more, let's say this, what we're really asking is this, is, well, actually, what we're really asking is, how does a microphone exist? That's really what we're asking. Like, how does a microphone exist? Does it exist is there such a thing as a microphone that exists independent of any mind?
Mm.
That's the beginning of the question. I'm just asking. We're not yet at the middle way, and we're not yet at the. We're not really getting into the details yet of the mind-only school, but that's a fair question, right? Is there such a thing as a microphone that exists independent of any mind?
A question that I have is, to take a very similar analogy, if I were to look at a cake, and instead of perceiving a cake, if just by naturally I saw grains of wheat, eggs, water, then would you then be saying that I would be at that point in time experiencing the ultimate truth and being in a state of emptiness?
It's a great question. Like, and one thing I'll say is, so, like, and the only way to answer it would be to say, well, according to which tenet system now, right? Like, in other words, when you said, if I were to perceive, right, just the grains of wheat and egg and sugar and so on, right? Like, in a sense, if you were a follower of the lowest of the four schools, right, the Great Exposition School, right? Then if you were perceiving the minutest particles, right, somehow like the minutest particle of sugar, the minutest particle of flour, the minutest particle of egg and whatever else, milk or something, right, dairy or whatever, and then you were realizing, right, like, now they don't meditate on cake necessarily, they usually meditate on the self, but same idea, let's follow it, right? And then you're realizing that that those particles are empty of cakeness. Right?
But the irony is then they have so much more potential
Yeah.
because they're not found in the,
Right.
the cake.
Yeah. So that would be, in one sense, if you were realizing that, I mean, that kind of gets at, I mean, experientially, I think that kind of touches on that experience of that first of the four tenet systems, right? That they would perceive the minutest particles, right? But what's there to say this? But realize that the cake is not the ultimate truth of the cake, right? Like, but they would be still holding on to those minute particles that somehow truly exist in. So that would kind of get the flavors. I really turned to the cake, but the flavor of that school's position in a way. Does that make sense? Yeah. So I think that's a good description, in a way, of that school's sort of something in that school's experience. In a way. They sort of emphasize this idea of minute particles, but without the superimposition. With not, we're recognizing that any superimposition onto those of sort of is a conventional truth, right? So cakeness would be a conventional truth in some sense. Right? Yeah. And so that would sort of get at that school's way of seeing the world in a way.
And wouldn't that be the same as microphone-ness?
From that school's point of view, right?
From that school's point
they
of
might
view.
see minute in that case it would be
Right.
sugar, or it would be minute particles of metal, for
Exactly.
example. Right? But then, from that school's point of view, right? The concept of microphone would be clearly a conventional
Yeah,
truth, not an ultimate truth, right?
right.
But that's not the mind-only school's position. That's a different. Yeah.
Right.
Is this strictly physical? Because what's making me think about this is the opposite, is what the mind sees that doesn't exist. And what I mean by that is that you could get yourself all worked up about something, or play a scenario out in your head where it can actually get your heart going, and you get, so that's what I'm saying, is that you create some monster in your head for what the mind sees that does not exist. Is this in that same realm, or are we talking about physical things that we're looking at?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, first of all, yes, we are talking about something similar, and what you said, what the mind sees that doesn't exist.
If the mind sees that doesn't exist, and we do it all the time. You could be at work, and you're going to play out. They're going to do this is going to go wrong. You get all this stuff in your head, and the mind is seeing all this stuff that doesn't exist. It didn't even happen yet. It may not happen, but the mind sees things that doesn't exist and takes you. So I'm just thinking about like non-physical.
Yeah. No, that's, and again, I'm going to put aside the mind-only school for a moment and just answer the question generally. Then yes, we are talking about that, and in one sense, like I want to go back to the the two lower schools for a moment, okay? So the one, not yet the mind only, but those other schools, right? In a sense, to follow up on what your question is, they would say, actually, right, that actually believe that one of the things that doesn't exist that we see, right, is a self-sufficient, substantially existent, unitary person. And based on that, which doesn't really exist, but we're seeing, is that we're seeing that as if it were truly existent. It doesn't. That itself is not the ultimate truth. But that based on that, we then make up all kinds of other conceptual elaborations. So in other words, that when we feel I substantially independently exist over here, and that person substantially independently exists over there, and I don't like their facial expression, and I don't like their tone of voice. And then we can make up all kinds of things, right? Because we believe in that, I'm going to use the word superimposition, that projection, then we make up all kinds of other projections, right? Like, then we can say, therefore, they frowned at me, I don't like them, I want to get even with them, I'm going to frown back at them, and then I'm going to talk about them behind their back, and so on. And, then we can go from there into thousands of elaborations, right? But what those earlier two schools are saying is that all those other elaborations arise, in a sense, from that most basic misunderstanding, that's perceiving the substantial, independent self, and that based on that once we create the idea of a substantial, independent self, right, me. Then we create substantial independent idea of mine. Then we create substantial, not mine, other. Then the dangerous other. And then my group. And then if they harm, then if the other harms my group, and so on. Then we can create all kinds of conceptual elaborations that lead. And all these Buddhist schools agree to this actually. That then those concepts lead to anger, hatred, jealousy, pride. So whereas when we hold this idea of an independent, substantially existent I, right, then we can also feel I'm better than so-and-so, and then I'm worse than this person, and then I want to get that person to like me. So all the Buddhist schools, actually all these tenets agree that we then make up all kinds of things, actually, that don't truly, that are just, what's the word, conceptual elaborations, we could call it, that create all kinds of problems. But in the back.
Okay, but wouldn't those conceptual elaborations be considered as ignorance, if you think about it? Because what it's all based on is when you're thinking about the non-physical, it's all connected to the emotions and the feelings that we feel. And yet, when you develop all these constructs, then to me it sounds like as if with all the emotions that goes attached with it, that it's all pretty much goes back into the concept of ignorance. Is that ignorance?
Yeah. So and really get it this way, from a so is this usually when. So in Buddhist psychology, actually, in terms of ignorance, the idea of even from these lower schools' points of view, right, the idea of belief in an independent, unitary, substantially existent person, right, the belief in that is actually the fundamental ignorance, really. So yes, it's ignorance. What they would say then is that usually in Buddhist psychology, they differentiate. They say then, based on ignorance, other afflictive emotions arise. So they would say, for example, if you then, let's say, because I believe in a substantially existent, independent, unitary person here, right? Mm-hmm. And then somebody does something that person, so I feel they're other, and I don't like what they did, right? Then if I give rise to hatred of them, they would say hatred is not, from Buddhist psychology point of view, they don't call hatred ignorance. They would say, hatred arises in dependence on ignorance. So based on that ignorance, grasping at the substantial, the sort of independent me and independent them, then I give rise to hatred. So they would say that the other negative emotions, which you were mentioning, arise in dependence on the ignorance. So ignorance is sort of one of the many negative emotions, but it's the most important one because it's the one that all the others arise from. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So once I have the ignorance of I, then I have mine, and then once so those are ignorance. But then once those give rise to, let's say I say I and mine, right? But then I start wanting that, and I crave it. And then craving would arise from ignorance, but it's not a form of ignorance. It's another afflictive emotion. But it only arises in dependence upon that ignorance.
So ignorance is the main basis.
Yes, exactly.
Got it.
Yeah. And somebody else had.
Yeah.
Or you had one.
Mine is very basic because it's my first
Yeah, yeah.
time being here.
It was a heavy. You jumped in the deep end today a little
Yeah,
bit.
it's
Sorry.
very confusing.
Yeah,
I've been thinking about you saying that there is no soul.
Mhm.
So, if there is no I, there is no soul, then can we, I mean, what are we here for? Can we make a difference? Is there a purpose? You know, we're talking about all these concepts of particles and, you know, things not existing. But knowing all that knowledge, how does that pacify my mind? How does that give me, you know, a sense of, you know, existence and meaning?
So first of all, I'll say this, like, just to clarify something, and then I'll answer the question. From any of these Buddhist tenet systems points of view, even the middle way school, which is the most subtle, there is an I. That's important to clarify. There is a self. It's just that self is not the ultimate. It's not an ultimate truth. That's the first thing. So I just want to clarify that, just in case people get confused. So it's not saying there's no self, but it's saying that, in a sense, you're saying that the self is not. Different schools would put it different ways. I'm also hesitant how to say it right, but let's put it. I'll just say it this way: that all of these schools agree that conventionally there is an I that walks around, that eats, that goes to sleep, that wakes up. So none of them are refuting that, right? That would be nihilism. So I just want to clarify that. But that doesn't answer your question. So I just want to say that as a preface. But then I want to say this, like from a Buddhist perspective, right? And each of these schools again looks at it slightly differently, but they all have a general similarity. But I want to give it as a general answer. So it would be this. It would be that actually, I'll say it this way. Like, I want to answer from the middle way school's perspective, okay? Because that's the highest school. So that's the best one to answer from that question. What I want to say is this: so the middle way school actually is founded. There is the very basis of that school says what I started with today, that the purpose of life is compassion and love, right? That the purpose, in other words, that it starts with a recognition that I and others suffer and have problems and have difficulties, and that that the very purpose of our existence is to alleviate that suffering of ourselves and others, and especially, you know, others are countless and suffer so much, and that the purpose of life is compassion. Actually, that's really clear. That's the fundamental basis. And then you could say, well, then what's the purpose of analyzing the nature of the self? So what they would say really is this, is that in order to alleviate suffering, right, and Shantideva says, like, any alleviation of suffering is helpful, even giving somebody, you know, even if you just alleviate somebody's headache for 1 hour, that's good. You know? But then he says, Shantideva, who's a great Buddhist master, says, you know, so any alleviation of suffering, any compassionate action is beneficial, right? Is a good thing. But then he says, if we can get rid of the deeper causes of the suffering, that's even more compassion, even a more effective method, and a more effective expression of compassion. And so then, like from that middle way school's perspective, they would say, so if the purpose of life is to alleviate the suffering of all others, as much as I possibly can, what they would say is this, so if as her question implied, that if ignorance that misunderstands the nature of my own mind, myself, and others, creates afflictive emotions like anger, jealousy, hatred, pride, you know, craving, and so on. So what that school is saying psychologically is that those are the causes of suffering. So that misperceiving the nature of the self, for example. So it's not the self doesn't exist at all, but we misperceive it, and therefore, as that question gave rise to, then we give rise to all kinds of like anger and hatred, even wars and so on. So what that school would really say is, so the purpose of all this analysis, in a sense, is to develop not just intellectually, but ultimately, like in our own experience and through meditation, a kind of deep experience of wisdom that understands the ultimate nature of how things do and don't exist. And that through that, we learn how to uproot the causes of suffering, not just suffering itself, but the inner causes of it, both for ourselves and also then for others, by helping them. And so that's really the purpose of all this, in other words, is, so in a general sense, the purpose is love and compassion, alleviating suffering. But then they would say, you know, the more wisdom you have about how you exist, about how things exist, about the nature of things, the more effective you'll be at alleviating suffering. That's really the answer. And so then one analyzes and contemplates these different things, you know, different positions or ideas, in order to understand, well, what's the best way to uproot the causes, the inner causes of ignorance and suffering, and so on, and the other, you know, the inner causes of ignorance, the other afflictive emotions, and therefore suffering. And so that's really the purpose of all this analysis. Does that make sense? So really the purpose of it is compassion. That's really,
So the wisdom we're doing supports love and compassion.
yes.
So we're trying to increase, to get like a method to support.
Yes. Yeah. And these schools also, like, especially if you look at the middle way school's position, right, which I was talking about a little bit last time about dependent arising, right? Because the middle way school's fundamental position is that interdependence or dependent arising is the ultimate meaning of emptiness, and the ultimate meaning of emptiness is interdependence or dependent arising, right? So from that point, school's perspective, especially, I think it's very clear then, right, what you're saying. In other words, that if one realizes that school, which we didn't get to today yet, but we'll get there eventually, you know, but that school's position is dependent arising and emptiness are, have the same meaning, ultimately, right? So from that school's point of view, right, then you can see how from a conventional point of view, right, it's recognizing that my own well-being and others' well-being is interdependent. Right? And so then, for sure, right, the more you understand emptiness, the more you understand dependent arising. The more you understand dependent arising, the more you understand emptiness. So from that school's point of view, definitely then it gives rise to this sense of how wisdom gives rise to compassion, and compassion leads towards wisdom, right? You can see how that would happen, right, if there's a recognition of interdependence, right? And that school, you know, I mean, and all Buddhists, actually, especially the Mahayana schools, right, they always talk about, right, my well-being is dependent on others. Others' well-being is dependent on me. That's clearly true, right? And so you can see how the more deeply, you know, whether you understand it on a gross level or a subtle level, both are important, actually, in this sense, because they're all true. There's dependence, interdependence is true, that they give, so therefore, understanding that gives rise to deeper and deeper compassion. And then that compassion, you can see how compassion and wisdom are totally compatible in this sense. That's also why they say in Buddhism that, you know, if you gain wisdom, actually, this also answers your question on another level, I just want to say it philosophically, that from a Buddhist point of view, like, accurate wisdom, actually, accurate wisdom that cuts off ignorance, the Dalai Lama often emphasizes this point, undermines negative emotions like jealousy and hatred and anger and rage and craving and so on, because those are based on this false concept of an independent I and mine and you and yours, right? But when you gain this kind of wisdom that cuts off those, there still is the conventional I, right, that's not undermined. And that conventional I, what's its nature? Dependence, interdependence, right? Dependent arising. And so, in one sense, what the Dalai Lama often points out, which is very profound, really, is that wisdom understanding selflessness or emptiness undermines negative emotions like hatred, but supports the positive emotions like compassion. And so that's really interesting, right? So in other words, it doesn't, when you're actually in meditation on emptiness, they say even, you're not thinking about compassion at that time because you're meditating on emptiness, but they actually can say that compassion can influence, bodhicitta, they talk about, can influence that meditation. And then when you come out of that meditation, your bodhicitta and your compassion are even more powerful. So that wisdom undermines the negative emotions, but it doesn't undermine love. It doesn't undermine compassion. It doesn't undermine gratitude, for example, right? Because gratitude comes out of an understanding of our interdependence, right? So anything that, in other words, the positive emotions that are grounded in an understanding of our interdependence, like love, compassion, gratitude, appreciation, you know, and so on, right? Those are actually supported by wisdom. But wisdom sort of is like a, I sometimes, you know, for modern terminology, I would say it's like a computer virus that destroys, you know, the coding of the negative emotions in a way. So, because they're grounded in a kind of ignorance, right? So as wisdom undermines ignorance, it sort of destroys the root cause of those afflictive emotions without destroying the cause of the positive emotions. And so that's how somebody can become a Buddha, actually. Whereas if one understands, this is also why you can see how the more you understand emptiness, the more you understand, oh, then that's what Buddhahood is, actually, in a sense, right? A Buddha, all a Buddha is, from one, there was one definition of what's a Buddha, right? So a Buddha is somebody who's destroyed not just the afflictive emotions, that all they've destroyed all their afflictive emotions, but they've also destroyed the causes of those in their own psyche, right? They can't give rise to them anymore because they've destroyed the ignorance that could allow those to arise. But at the same time, they've completed all the good qualities of love, compassion, skill. You know, and skill, what does skillful mean? They often talk Buddha is very skillful, right? It's just because the Buddha understands interdependence, right? For since things arise interdependently, the better you understand how things arise interdependently, right, independently, then the more skillful you are at helping others, because that's how you help others, right? Is you create the causes and conditions that allow others to flourish, right? And that's why, so like they say, does that make sense? Like, so it's all like that issue of dependence or interdependence or dependent arising and emptiness is very profound in terms of these issues that you guys are asking about.
Going back, this is my first time here.
Okay.
You were talking about suffering.
Yep.
And isn't suffering a vehicle for knowledge, which in turn, with that knowledge, then you learn compassion?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, and actually, and usually we say first compassion. First, we recognize it. I mean, you can almost say, by recognizing our own suffering, we develop compassion for ourselves, and then we use that as a basis for understanding others' suffering. We develop compassion for others, and then that can expand out more and more as we look at it honestly and analyze it. Yes, definitely. That's definitely correct. Yeah, other comments or questions? So maybe, since we only have a few minutes left, maybe I'll just should I briefly describe the view of the mind-only school, just so people get, you get what that is anyway. I want to be clear, like, this school actually, what I want to say that, actually maybe more important, I'll emphasize another point. So like, this whole issue of tenets, right? Like I said, I started at the beginning, these are like steps, right? And so really, like the purpose of studying these things, right, would be wisdom, right? Would be understanding, ultimately it's understanding interdependence, right? That's the ultimate. Dependent arising in emptiness is the ultimate purpose of things. So these are just, in a sense though, if false projections or false impositions or false concepts about how we exist and about how other objects exist are the cause of suffering, these are different methods for overcoming those. Does that make sense? So different ways of understanding reality in order to overcome our false projections or false superimpositions or false concepts about reality. And actually, I want to make a more general statement about that. Like, because actually, there are very, I actually want to start with I said at the very beginning, I said the first of all the four, remember, not the four tenet systems, but the four seals, remember I started with that, is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. Right? In a way, that is designed, right? This is not yet about emptiness at all, right? But permanence and impermanence, right? Whereas what that's getting at is that ordinarily, we actually, out of ignorance, a kind of gross ignorance, this is not subtle ignorance, but a gross ignorance, we kind of, we impose or we project an idea of permanence onto things. And even though the nature of things, this is obvious, right? The very nature of all, everything that arises due to causes and conditions, its very nature is impermanence. That's obvious, right? But it's true, actually. When you go see a mountain, for sure you feel like it's permanent, right? Like, you see a mountain and there's this feeling of, wow, solidity and permanence there. You don't recognize that it's made up of, first of all, mostly what? Space in between tiny particles. Those tiny particles are made up of parts, and right, and those parts are whatever, and so on. Like all these things we're analyzing, right? But I'm just going at gross level here, right? You superimpose permanent. When you go to Washington D.C. and you see those big heavy buildings, right? You feel, they're permanent because they were here before you were born, right? And they sort of seem very solid, and you don't recognize they're changing instant by instant. Right? And the same thing happens, right? When you're when you're attached to somebody, right? And when you want them to do what you want, right? Like, we all have this, right? I'm just getting gross level now, right? That, like, in normal life, right? So you're attached to somebody and you want them, you're attached to them, which means also that you want them to do what you want and to be how you want them to be, right? And you have this idea that they're this person, and actually there's no recognition in that moment at all, right? That they're changing instant by instant, right? Their mind and their body, not even a second do they remain, right, as something substantially permanent, right? Their nature is impermanent. And actually, if you contemplate it, you know it, right? Or it's like, we all went to even in elementary school, right, where they have a little design with an atom that has the electrons spinning around. So like if you look at a body, in theory, you know it's that, but that's not how you perceive a body. Right? You see it as something solid. And we know the mind, if we look at our own mind, is changing every instant, right? But actually, when you look at the other person, you feel they're like this, and they should be like that, and I want them to do this, and you feel like there's something very, what's the word? Permanent, actually, right? And what Buddhism's saying, right, is that it's a false projection, right? It's a false superimposition. It's a false, something that you're imposing on reality that's not really accurate, right? And all Buddhism's saying is this, is the more, whether it's there are gross levels of projecting, and there are subtle and very subtle levels of projecting that we do onto reality. What Buddhism's saying is the more you project onto reality that's inaccurate, the more you suffer. And the more accurately you perceive reality, the less you suffer. Does that make sense? Actually, right? So, in other words, if you recognize things, if you recognize what's impermanent for what it is, which is impermanent, right? Then you don't expect something of that other that's unrealistic. Right? That makes sense, doesn't it? So this is a very gross, I just want to go back to a very simple level, just to make sure it's clear, right? So in a sense, all of these different Buddhist, philosophical and meditative things, most of them are ways of cutting off or sort of helping us to see and then stop doing this process of imposing false things on others. Does that make sense? And so, the one of permanence versus impermanence, in a way, if you really watch your mind, right, as you go around, so you go out and you see your car, you go see your house, you go see your, what's in your fridge and so on, right? And if you watch your mind, you can see how the mind has this habit of feeling actually, if you have something that you buy from the store that you really like, right, and then suddenly it went bad, right? It seems like, suddenly I bought this and I really wanted to eat it, I didn't get around to it for 2 days, and suddenly it went bad, right? And then you feel upset or annoyed, right? I'm just giving a very simple example, right? Well, that shows how you had this idea of it didn't suddenly go bad, actually, right? It was going bad from the moment it was on the vine, right? Whereas that's the nature of things, right? And your body is the same, right? But we don't, when we say, oh, how could that have happened? What's wrong with that store? They don't use fresh stuff, whatever, in other words, you could see, I'm just giving an example of everyday life, that you can see how you're superimposing something, some idea that things should be permanent. They're not, right? Or you go out and you try to start your car and it doesn't work, and you go, oh, how could this happen? Right? Well, it's made up of parts. It arose due to causing conditions. That's its very nature. Someday your car is not going to work, right? And someday your house is going to fall down, right? And someday your computer is going to stop working, right? You turn it, when you press start and it doesn't turn on, you go, oh, why? What's going on? As if something strange, right? What Buddhism is saying is wow, that's a funny concept, because its nature is that. Right? You're getting upset at something for being what it always was and what it by very nature is, right? And the same thing with your own body, right? When you get sick, right? Thinking, I don't have time for this, and I've got to do something, right? It's the nature of your body, right? Is that sometimes that happens, right? And then someday you're going to die, right? Just like your computer's going to break, just like your house. Whereas all things that arise due to causes and conditions, right, are impermanent, changing moment to moment, and will eventually cease, right? And so I'm just giving you an example, right? So you can see from the point here, though, is to really relate it to your experience, to notice, wow, look as I relate to things, how I superimpose this idea, right? And then I have emotions based on that. And then when you see the emotion, you press the start button on your thing and it doesn't work, right? You go, oh, how could that, what's going on? Or how could that be? That's not right. And then you get annoyed or something, right? But that's the nature of that object, right? And so it's if you develop a more realistic attitude, then you relax more, right? And you feel more at peace, and you accept the nature of what is, right? So then let's get just one step more subtle, right? Mine, right? Mine versus yours, right? So all these Buddhist tenet systems have this in common, right? Does mineness exist inherently in any object that is mine? No. There's no way, right? Whereas it really feels that way to me, right? Whereas like I feel like, in other words, if I look at my car versus somebody else's car, I feel very different, right? If I look at my house versus somebody else's house, that's a different feeling, right? But minus is clearly a convention, right? It's a social convention or a legal convention, right? In culture and in language and so on. But clearly, no object is inherent. There's no object, even if you print your name on it, right? It's still not inherently yours, actually, right? But what's the right way to say it? Like, you can see how you see how your mind, though, for sure, right? Our minds superimpose that and feel, and do you see how you feel it's there in the object? You do, actually, right? Like, there is that, and it's funny, right? Like, because whereas when, like, if you think of a car or a house or a money, we give that example of $100 bill or whatever, like in another class. But like, it's funny in a way, right? Because before somebody else owned your house, or if you were the first person to own it, somebody's going to own it after you. You'll be dead, right? And somebody else might be living there, right? And actually, like, there's nothing in any of that wood or whatever, or metal, that has anything to do with you inherently, right? But you have this feeling when you look at the thing, once you say it's mine, right? Do you see how like a certain feeling arises? And and that feeling, right, can give rise to, actually, like, think about it, right? That feeling of right, is the cause of war, right? It's the cause of murder, right? It's the cause of all kinds of violence, right? Just that feeling, this is mine, right? Then you're trying to take mine, right? Then I'll kill you, right? That happens that's human history, right? Like, and I'm just pointing these things out, right? Because what we're getting at really is, can I change that in me, right? My experience of mine. Because if I can't change that, I can't help somebody else to change that. If I still have this idea of mine that's so concrete, how am I going to help somebody else change their idea of mine and not kill somebody else, right? Because I haven't even changed yet. And so that's really what these tenet systems are getting at. I'm just giving it a very like gross level now, right? And so, because they all are methods to overcome the sense of mine, right? Of this inherently existent mine. That like then I would fight you for this, right? Like, it's kind of funny, right? I'm just elaborating for a moment, just like to talk, but like to discuss this, to think about it, right? But actually, the idea of like with other person, right? My spouse or my whatever, like my boyfriend or girlfriend or something, right? Like, again, is that conventionally valid? Sure, but nobody's arguing that, right? But like, do you notice how you actually start, once you get to a certain point with that idea, right? You maybe label it, right? On a first date, nobody labels that strongly, right? But eventually, if people stay together, right, then they label it so strongly they would like do anything, right? People do all kinds of things, right, based on that label, right? I mean, even when they would kill the other person, then they would like, if the other person says, no, I'm not yours, then they might want to kill them or something, right? But actually, like, a person can't be yours, right? Like, there's nothing in them, not one cell in their body that's yours, right? Like, it can't be. Right? And their mind can't be yours. You can't own a mind, right? Like, so but you make a label, and then you believe that label, right? And then you do all kinds of things, right? You feel jealous if somebody else is talking to them, right? You feel like, you see how all the afflictive emotions can come, right? You can get jealous so easily, you can get angry, you can get possessive, you can get grasping, right? All from this label mind that actually is just a convention, right? It's just a word, right? But it actually doesn't subsist in the object at all. Object, I mean the other person, in this sense. Rather, it subsists only in your own concept, right? So do you see how these things are very, like, I just want to point out, like, these are really, like, in one way you can say, well, so, yeah, of course, I label it mine, and conventionally it is yours. I'm not debating that. But the belief that it's there in the object, do you see how, like, people do all kinds of things? Like, whereas it gives rise to so much afflictive emotions, getting back to the questions, some people ask questions. And so that's why these things are really important in terms of liberating yourself. And the last thing I'll say before, I just want to explain this, is so you could say, well, and there's, it's reasonable for somebody to ask, so why study these different subtleties of difference of, how the eye exists? And like Jody's question was quite profound, right? Like, whereas, well, if it has parts, the table, right? You said that. If a table has parts, then is it really a table, right? From its own side, right? It was a question you raised, which is a good question. Right? And so you could say, well, why is that even important, right? But I want to say this, like, what these questions are getting at in a way is going back to one of the questions, is anything that cuts off any superimpositions, like any false ideas, like permanence, for example, is helpful, right? Because it decreases our grasping at something not true. What Buddhist psychology is saying is this middle way school's ultimate view of emptiness, right? If you can uproot that, it's the most subtle of all false projections, false superimpositions, false ideas, right? What they're saying really is that that's the what they're being very precise at identifying is the most subtle of all wrong understandings about the self and objects. And what they're just saying is this, psychologically, the Buddhist assertion is, if you can uproot that, all the other false ideas will be cut off also by one. Like, in other words, the other, it's like by that one insight, all the other ones will also end. And so that's why that one, from a Buddhist perspective, they would say, I mean, not just from a Buddhist perspective, we would say is, if that's true, right, you could debate it. We're encouraging debate here, right, so you can debate, but what we're really saying is this, is if that's true, right, then that's very precious, actually, right? Because if these false impositions create jealousy and murder and war and stealing and all those other things, then if there's something that can uproot those in our own mind, then we can become liberated, is the idea, from suffering. Right? From all these, because otherwise, if you're always having to say, well, okay, try to be less jealous, try to be less angry, try to be less, I mean, that's good. It's better than being more angry and more jealous and more hateful. But if there's something that can uproot the root cause of them so that they won't arise again, that's really precious, right? Because then you destroy suffering from its root, right? And then you can help others destroy suffering from its root for themselves also. So that's why this is an important question. Is like, but again, you can debate, right? Is that true? Is that the most subtle? And destroying it, will it uproot all those others? That you have to check, but that's the Buddhist assertion, right? That's what Buddhism is asserting. That's what the Buddha asserted, and it's what Nagarjuna asserted, and so on. And so that's why there are all these like subtle distinctions. Is what they're saying also is that if you, like many people actually would meditate, right? Actually, Lama Tsongkhapa says this in his one of his texts. That he says, many people were wonderful. Like in Tibet, he gave his name. He said many people were like very compassionate, very kind, very skillful in helping others, and so on. And they meditated on emptiness, but they didn't understand the ultimate meaning of emptiness. They misunderstood it. They kind of missed the ultimate meaning by a little bit. Right? And so then, still their afflictive emotions came back. And they made so much effort. But because they didn't understand this one point, then they didn't achieve liberation for themselves, and then they couldn't help others as skillfully. And he says, he writes in the beginning of this book, so he says, so now I'm going to explain it very, very clearly, so that in the future people can understand it more correctly, and then their afflictive emotions won't come back, right? And then they can help others more effectively. And he says, the purpose is compassion. He says right there at the beginning of that explanation, it's called The Essence of Eloquence, that book I'm referring to. I'm not using the exact words that he said, but I'm paraphrasing, right? So he says, so now I'm going to, out of compassion, I'm going to explain it very precisely, he says, because otherwise, right, otherwise you go to so much effort, but still your negative experiences keep coming back, right? And what Buddhist psychology is saying is if you can understand emptiness precisely and meditate on it in deep meditation, then you won't have them come back. And you'll finally achieve some, not just peace, but lasting or permanent mental peace, right? A mental peace that doesn't get destroyed ever. And that then you can help others more effectively is the point there. So does that make sense at least? I just want to explain why would you even ask these questions? Those are the reasons from Buddhist point of view. So I answered it very elaborate. The way it was all an elaborate answer to your question. But I think it was important, right? Because in other words, we were studying these topics, but then you say, well, why, right? So that's the reason why. And and these other and these other Buddhist teachers, right? Like they said these other stances on emptiness are very deep, actually, right? And they do help one to decrease one's suffering. But that's why I was just leading up towards that middle way school, because that's like the hardest one to understand, actually. It's the most subtle. And so these other schools help you, or they're just ways of helping the mind to get ready, in a way, to understand something that subtle, right? And I'll say one last comment on that, and then we'll stop. Just the last comment is this, is because one thing that in his, again I'm quoting Lama Tsongkhapa in another text, is that we studied that retreat, the praise to dependent origination. Right? In that text he says, and this is really important because the point of dependent arising and emptiness is what I'm really emphasizing here. But in that text he says even other philosophers actually, right? He doesn't use these exact words, I'm paraphrasing, but he says even other philosophers he said they take dependence, right? Dependent arising, And they use that as a basis to think things are truly inherently existent, substantially existent. And he says whereas really it's dependent arising that proves things are not inherently, truly, independently existent, right? And he says that's the key, right? And he says, but this is why it's so important to be precise, is that otherwise sometimes we'll meditate on the most profound interdependence, right? Dependent arising. And if you take that as a way of thinking, some Buddhist philosophy, you can see how they think that though, right? They think, well, if something's dependent, it must truly inherently exist. And he's saying, no, Nagarjuna is saying, no, what's dependent it can't be inherently independently existent. It has to be dependently existent. So it's empty of having its own independent nature, right? Or its own true nature. Right? Its nature is dependence. Anyway, we'll get more into that next time. So, are people okay with do people want something simpler though, or should we continue with tenets? I don't know. I mean, I took a chance doing that today because I thought it was serious, where it's a little more serious, like philosophical study. Is it too much for people? Or?
It's good.
I don't know. Well, we'll see. I mean, I also go back and forth to something a little simpler, but maybe I'll continue on and try to say. I didn't really explain the mind-only school because it's hard. That's very hard. Maybe we have to do the three natures. I don't know if you want to do that, but.
My mind was having a tough time dealing with my brain not being mine. But then you think of organ transplants, and that's one to meditate on.
Yeah, it is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll do a little more on tennis, and then we'll switch back to this meditation. But okay, we should just dedicate our merits. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta, where is not arisen, arise and go, where has arisen, yet doth decrease, but increase. By virtue of this studying together, actually, let's dedicate like that. May all of us here, right, and then all others, live the life with compassion, with love, with bodhicitta. May our wisdom increase. And through that wisdom, may we be able to uproot the causes of suffering and its causes, in ourselves and in all other beings, in order to bring about peace, and happiness,